Alrighty then, folks, I wanted to do something a little bit different for this video, and specifically on my channel. I wanted to start covering some really cool guns that we've seen in games. This particular example, as you can see, is actually an M1 Garand. This particular one is in an M1 Sage stock. Now, you probably are more familiar with this from watching the Garand Thumb video on this, as you probably saw that he had what he referred to as a tanker Garand, which is obviously the cut down version of the M1, although in reality no tanker Garands actually really existed because there's only one surviving prototype of that rifle in the Springfield Armory, which are the guys that made this particular rifle, or rather built it because it was made by, of course, John Garand. But with all of this said, the Sage stock version of this particular rifle is one of my favorites. It is extremely hard to come by nowadays, and certainly does make the rifle attach a lot more different options onto it than would have been provided by the factory. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you guys about today, aside from obviously some of the neat features about this particular version of a stock, is also just the different variants of the M1 Garand, as there have been quite a few variations that have come out over the years, and I will do an addendum to this video because there are simply too many of them to actually really talk about. But the ones that are really noteworthy, aside from the kind of shortened down Garand, which of course was meant to be actually given to tankers and, for example, pilots, so that they could have a fighting weapon if they ever needed to be out of their vehicle for whatever reason, needed to ditch their vehicle, etc. But there was also the sniper variant of the Garand that came a lot later in the war, and I'll put some photos up so you can see them. There actually were two different sniper variants. One of them actually saw active combat, the other one pretty much didn't. It is sort of unclear whether or not that particular sniper variant ever ended up really seeing the light of day in combat operations. There is some hearsay that it made it to the Korean War, although certainly that latest variant did not really see any action during World War II or any of those theaters, at least according to any photographic or hearsay evidence that is available out there on the net. The other really interesting variant of the Garand, for me at least, was actually the one that was designed by Beretta. At one point, Beretta had their hands on the M1 Garand rifle, and they decided they actually wanted it to chamber from magazines as opposed to using the end block clip that is pretty much well known for the Garand rifles just across the world over, whatever you want to call it. And the interesting part is that in addition to remanufacturing the gun to accept these magazines, it was chambered in 308, so different from the 30-06 Springfield that you would normally find in a typical Garand rifle. But the other part that I found quite interesting at the time is that they actually had, unlike the flash hider which was typical on the M1D Garands, that particular weapon actually had a muzzle brake. Now, there is historic evidence that muzzle brakes were indeed used on sniper variants of the M1 Garand during the war. Those are few and far between, and to my knowledge that is not a variant that was actively made by the factory. It seems like it was more something that the soldiers did, possibly with a gunsmith, while they're out in the field. Now, the other really neat variant of the Garand is the T20E series of the rifle. Now, there were a number of different T20X, whatever you want to call them, variants out there that existed as the Garand was trying to be modernized. They were trying to slowly turn it into a battle rifle that would compete with the likes of the AK and the likes of the FAL, which were starting to become obviously a lot more popular at that time, as the Garand had lived its life well into the Vietnam War before being effectively replaced by the M14 rifle. But with that said, obviously the T20E had a lot of its shortcomings. Not unlike the Beretta, it was also designed to be chambered basically from your regular magazine. Very interesting design, or I guess I should say fed from the magazine if that's what you guys really prefer at that point. But the kind of interesting portion of that particular rifle is that it actually had what appeared to be an early form of an adjustable gas system. So you actually had a gas plug that could be changed depending on what sort of ammunition you were running, and I suppose at one point they must have thought they wanted the gun suppressed, as you didn't want to necessarily overpressure the system by running the gas system in its sort of more aggressive mode. But that kind of covers it for today's video as far as the various Garand variants. I'll try and see if I can dig up some more information on the other ones that have kind of come out, and specifically the modernizations of this rifle. Now, most people, when they see a Garand like this, they look at it and they say, oh, look at that, you've bubbled up your Garand. Obviously, not everybody likes this. A lot of people do not like the sort of modernization of the Garand in general. They don't like that to be done, as that's something that is considered generally heresy. In my opinion, the ability to mount stocks that do not involve you having to drill into the existing receiver to be able to mount sort of the existing kind of army surplus scope mounting options and sort of some of the original, I guess you could say, GI versions of these scopes is something that I would prefer, basically not having to do in general. Now, this particular rifle here in this stock has not been modified in any way aside from the fact that it's been rebarreled with a Criterion barrel, as the original barrel had been shot through pretty much completely. So with that said, obviously the Criterion barrel is a modern barrel, so you're not going to fetch, a great price on this gun in the market nowadays, as basically owing to the fact that it no longer has some of those original parts. I believe it has had some receiver work done to it as well, to kind of make it feed a little bit better. I'm not sure if there's been anything done to the operating rod, which is this whole section right here, and you can actually see it riding down below within the sort of stock system in here. Now, one of the biggest problems, of course, with running this rifle with sort of modern ammunition is that generally those rounds have pretty hot powders, rather, quite a bit of grain, and typically they are overpressure for what this gas system was designed for, but specifically it is overpressure for the operating rod itself. And the result of this really high pressure in the system is that it has a tendency to either derail the rod completely, or you can actually bend the rod. Now, something that a lot of people don't realize is that the Garand rods are actually slightly bent from the factory, so when you take one out and you field strip your rifle, you may think that the rod is actually messed up, when in reality that is just how they are. But obviously, if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know what the bend radius should be, it is probably a good idea to take your rifle to a gunsmith and have it professionally checked out. Or if you don't want to spend the money, it could be a good idea to actually just go out and buy a new operating rod for yourself and do the work to make sure your rifle is operating safely, so that you're not doing any additional damage to its parts. But like I said, the really cool part about this stock is you're not making any permanent modifications to the rifle itself. You basically unscrew a couple of bolts, off this thing comes, and you're able to put on the original wooden stock, which I do also happen to have. But of course, the biggest benefit with having a modern stock system is the ability to very easily mount things like bipods without having to get something that mounts to the original system, which gives you a lot more flexibility as far as where and how far you're able to put your bipod for stable shooting, especially if you're not going to be at a range per se, but perhaps you are actually out in the wild, either hunting, or you just decide to do some target shooting in your backyard, on your ranch, whatever it happens to be. Also, it allows you to mount additional accessories. In my case, I do have an angled foregrip coming for this rifle, as I would like to essentially be able to still shoot it from my hands while standing without having to necessarily be on a bench all the time. The other obvious change, of course, is you have the top rail. Now, you could get top rails for the original M1 Garand as well. There are many different varieties. And the really cool part about those top rails is, again, you're only replacing just one tiny part of the rifle, which you can easily place back if need be. But this allows you to mount the scope or optic, whatever you end up running, in a lot more locations on the rifle itself than you otherwise would with the stock Garand. Now, one thing to keep in mind for this particular rifle is basically your scope and how it is being mounted. And the reason is that you definitely have to look out for eye relief. So in the particular case of this optic, the eye relief on this unit is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 inches, which means that if my head is back here, I'm no longer getting to see the full sight picture that this particular optic offers me, and that means that I will actually have to get a different rail in here to be able to run this particular optic on this rifle. If you happen to run a red dot holographic or a more typical full-length rifle scope, you will typically have a little bit more eye relief that is available, and of course with the red dots and holographics, it pretty much just doesn't matter. You'll be able to see whatever you need to. But anything from ACOGs to prism optics, which is essentially what this particular unit from Burris is, you're going to definitely want to get something like a Sadlac, or there's another company that actually makes a rail that goes into the back of this particular portion of the sight, basically replacing your original sight, allowing you to mount optics a lot closer to the cheek rest area, also again allowing you to run a much wider variety of optics that may not have the eye relief that you're looking for. But one of the main reasons why I wanted to run the particular optic that you see on this rifle right now is the ability to have the bullet drop within my scope itself. It also does have an illuminated reticle, and I've got full adjustability for windage and elevation, as well as 6 times magnification. Now, you could get 6 times magnification by using a red dot and a magnifier, but then typically you lose the ability to have those markings that show you essentially the different areas where your bullet might be able to drop. So this gives me a bit of an edge there without necessarily running a full-length sight, a telescopic sight, which obviously is not something that I'm going to be doing because I'm not going to be shooting out to those ranges, nor am I going to be firing that sort of ammunition. But the other part that I wanted to talk about is the flash hider itself. Obviously, the flash hider on this particular rifle, it is a pretty neat look, although I'm not the biggest fan of it. I do have basically a new muzzle brake that'll be replacing this particular part, as well as a threaded adapter that the muzzle brake will be going to, although I will at some point get some machine work done so that it is not quite as long, as I would still like to have a relatively compact rifle. Now, again, one of the things that is pretty neat about this particular stock itself is the ability for you to actually move your shoulder rest forward and back versus running like your typical sort of AR style buttstock, because you have now a lot more variability with this particular unit. Now obviously they do sell adjustable sort of AR style buttstocks, but I do like the ability to be able to fully compress this inwards as the result of this being a sort of skeletonized system. Basically, by pushing down on the button back here, I'm able to pull out the stock, or I'm able to collapse it in pretty much any way that I want. And one of the neat things is the fully adjustable cheek rest. Of course, you've got the ability to essentially unlock or unlatch this portion here, and then you essentially have a little opening down here where you can essentially just put an Allen wrench and then maneuver your cheek rest up until you're able to get a fairly good sight picture with whatever optic you happen to be running. Again, really neat feature about this particular stock that makes the rifle a bit more amenable to, I suppose you could say, more modern day sort of different communities where you might be going to shoot, because you have the variability of being able to collapse the rifle down a little bit. You also have the ability to then either do a hand firing position, or you can fire on the table, whatever it happens to be. The biggest probably drawback, I would say, of this particular system is of course the weight. You are putting a lot of aluminum on here versus the wood. Of course that is going to weigh quite a bit more. But really, I think the biggest weight in this rifle is actually coming from the barrel itself. It is quite a heavy barrel. I'm not sure if the Criterion barrels are heavier than the GI barrels as it stands. That is something I'll definitely want to look at some point down the road. But of course, the rifle itself is a really neat platform, and specifically I can see why Post Malone ended up getting himself one of these particular units. It is a piece of history. His, I believe, is a modified or cut down Garand. They do sell shortened kits that you can get. They have the shortened op rod, also the shortened barrel, and of course a gas system that has been modified to run in that sort of configuration. And I believe, although I'm not 100% sure on this, but he has actually had the Sage stock cut down, because I don't know if they actually made any sort of cut down versions of the Sage stock for the M1 Garand, sort of shortened versions, but it could also very well be that he's running some sort of modification on that rifle that allows him to run some of the M14 sort of variants there. Again, I'm not 100% sure on that particular portion of the video. I wish Garand Thumb had touched on that part a little bit more. I was lucky enough that I was able to get this rifle. There's not a whole lot of these stocks kind of floating around out there, and typically just the stock itself is hovering in the neighborhood of $900 to somewhere in between like $1,500 or so. And that's quite a bit of money to pay for the stock, but due to the very low supply on the market and people generally holding on to these rifles for various reasons aside from the fact that their value is skyrocketing, it is highly unlikely that this is a stock system that you would be able to get at this point in time unless you're willing to spend this amount of money. With that said, if you guys want to see more of these videos and you want to see this thing on the range, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you want to join my Patreon, every little bit helps, and I'll be able to bring you more videos, especially seeing this rifle in action and seeing it in action in various video games as it stands. With that, it's been Crazy Walder. I'll see you guys in the next video.